Welcome back to another episode of Elevated Thoughts, more specifically our Left versus Right series. Recycle Mike, we've got you here for another installment, and today, actually, you picked the topic, and I was interested to read about it this week a little more as someone who, didn't do too well in Economics 101 and probably dropped out of Economics 102. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about inflation and how the Biden economic policies have impacted our way of life, and how the changes that have come from the Trump administration and some of those policies, how they've been altered and how they compare to what's going on now. So what I'd like to kick off by saying here is Biden released a very famous piece of legislation called the Inflation Reduction Act. And as we've kind of touched on a few times, right, for example, the Don't Say Gay bill, which doesn't really prevent you from saying gay, the Inflation Reduction Act, in my opinion, I don't think it does really anything to reduce inflation. And I wonder what your take is on that, because isn't it kind of clickbaity, as we've been throwing around, to give it such a incendiary or what a beneficial bill it would be by its name? But when you look deeper, where the heck is the inflation reduction? So what are your thoughts on that? Why did they name it such a strange name?
Sure. So actually, I'll take this opportunity to shamelessly plug a Substack article that I recently published. The Inflation Reduction Act, and kind of very ironically, the Congressional Budget Office says that this does really nothing or has done nothing to affect inflation. And I would describe this bill as a nice, pretty piece of legislation. They put a nice dress and lipstick on it to get everybody's attention, and it's really just industrial policy disguised as some nice marketing and PR name like Inflation Reduction Act in an era where, arguably people are feeling it most impactfully in the last couple decades.
So to be clear, though, in your article, because I read it last night, very well written, and you cover in detail the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the CHIPS and Science Act. But what I would say is, you definitely support these bills. So while you acknowledge that the name might be misleading, at least in one case, I'd like to dive a little deeper into what these bills actually do, because I personally, looking more into it, do have my concerns about it. For example, just quickly, to give a almost $1 trillion check from the government to fund these subsidies, we've ran into big problems before, right? And I wonder if, you could speak a little bit about, because let me say this first. When Trump was in president, right, we went to a method of tariffs when we were dealing with China or Canada and Mexico, and we rewrote deals like NAFTA or exited the TPP. And when we implement tariffs, it encouraged more manufacturing in the United States, is what I felt happened. We made it more expensive to source goods from China and overseas, and that brought a lot more production back domestically. So in my opinion, those were a good thing. They encouraged a little bit of change and a little bit more of onshoring. So I'm curious what your feeling is when you compare a tariff and the pros and cons of such, but also then to a subsidy, where it's not so much we're collecting a tax in that way, we're kind of just doling out checks. So why do you prefer, in this case, like a subsidy method over a taxation or a tariff method?
Sure. So yeah, we're broadly speaking about the two ways that we can set up trade obstacles, as they're known, and you can affect industrial policy. You would do so because you're identifying either critical sectors or critical materials that you need to flow, either import or export certain technologies or lack thereof if you feel that they're proprietary and important. So what's currently happening is this a debate between whether we want to use tariffs, which are essentially a tax on consumers, and consumers, broadly speaking, also include U.S. companies, versus subsidies, which is spending, right? So this is something that we are going to allocate from currently existing tax revenues or just printing in some cases, as some people say, of money. But the difference in the IRA is that it's offset with some revenue gained from cost controls on Medicare prescription drugs, as well as an alternative minimum tax for corporations. So this actually, the same way you file your taxes and there's a minimum tax rate that you have to pay, sometimes your deductions could be more advantageous, but more often than not, you choose the standard minimum deduction. It creates the same situation for corporations. So the idea is that we're going to fund the Inflation Reduction Act by making corporations pay a minimum 15% tax. So gone are the days of you seeing a 0.5% marginal effective tax rate on corporations' income and when they register in the U.S.
Listen, I don't have my Reagan sweatshirt on today, but wouldn't you say that taxing a corporation at 15%, especially ones, maybe Apple or Amazon are very bad examples because they have such deep pockets. Probably they could afford a 15% rate. But these companies that invest so heavily into R&D, and actually that's part of the Chips and Science Act, right, is to put more focus on R&D on these big companies. If these companies are still realizing a loss, though, I would imagine that a 15% burden could be exactly that, and may actually stifle innovation, which is the exact purpose of these bills. So it is a little bit concerning to me. I guess the argument on the other side would be, hey, if these folks have to pay a tariff or have to pay higher wages domestically, then of course it's going to be offset in a similar way. The difference would be that money is passed to the consumer, which, yes, is a negative in a lot of ways, but it doesn't take off the bottom line of that company, which I don't know if you've ever ran a company. You're involved, I know, in the recycling business there as well at a higher level. But, when I look at simple balance sheets for the small things that I've done, it's not so simple, right? There's not just money flying in. And when you talk about 15%, that might be the entire earning margin of some of these smaller companies. So big companies, okay, 15%, not that big of a deal. Small businesses and early corporations that might be pressing the envelope to innovate, those are going to be affected negatively by a corporate tax rate like that. I didn't stump for trickle down in this case, but the truth is that businesses are not in this some sort of powerful, not the small business does not have all of these this ability to kind of swing their muscle around. 15% is crippling. So I just think that there might be a different way. And then to log it out, I think that we mentioned that it's something like an investment of $800 billion, right? Almost $1 trillion. I think it's in the sevens. And I'm not sure that the
consider
offset,
the toll spending, it comes to about $1 trillion. Yep.
And I'm not sure that the offset is really there to make up for it. I mean, gosh, it's just such a huge number. And what does that cover? 10 years, right?
Yep. So this would be amortized kind of effectively over 10 years. The plan is that, you're not going to get the spending back in a year or two. It does take at least 10 years. I probably not going to surprise you. I don't think those estimates are going to come in exactly as they are. That's always the idea, is that you overpromise this and the available funding that you'll be able to raise for it. But I think it represents a critically important change of direction in like our industrial policy. So I would say that this absolutely is very risky, right? There's situations that we don't want to create. I'm sure people will remember Solyndra under the Obama administration, where it got lots of subsidies and preferential loans to essentially go bankrupt, right, through frivolous spending, through company perks and things like that.
So that was a solar panel manufacturer in 2009 that got a huge, I think it was about $500 million or more. Obviously not anywhere near as large as this one, but in 2009, $500 million was quite a big check for the government to write, and that was through the Obama era. Similarly, kind of broadly named bill. I don't know if you recall the exact name, but it was like the Prosperity in America bill or something like this.
Yeah,
and what ended up happening is that, right, in this case of Solyndra, they relied on American manufacturing processes, and they found out they relied on materials from China. And as soon as China caught wind that the United States government's trying to compete, well, they said, no, we're going to use our materials and we're going to stop giving them to you, as far as I understood it. So this company basically filed bankruptcy within the next 2 years. And because of it, the U.S. government was up Schitt's Creek without a paddle, out $500 million. So, when I hear Trump say, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I would counter. So hopefully this time around, they're very cognizant of that fact, and there's certainly a bigger breadth of recipients of the funding through it. And it's interesting because it's codified into the tax law, right? So there's like almost $650 billion in tax savings that are built right into federal code. So we see a lot of companies taking advantage of this, and you see about 80% of the funding and the benefits of this bill are being allocated to like red districts, right? So people, as I say in my article, people are probably thinking like, oh, of course they're not going to turn down free money, but I think they're also incredibly excited about the potential of how many jobs this is going to bring and what kind of support services that go around that. So you're talking on the scale of some estimates needing 300,000 high tech, high skilled jobs to feed this industry that is now being subsidized with the IRA and the CHIPS Act. So how do we get there, right? You have 300,000 workers being on these various manufacturing plants, sustainability projects like creating new solar, wind, geothermal, et cetera. Even nuclear power has its place, hydrogen, et cetera. But then what's going to be nice about these is the town that's going to have this big factor in it with 2,000, 5,000 more workers. They're going to need their coffee. They're going to need their lunches during the day. They're going to want to go to happy hour. So hopefully all those other businesses start springing up around that, and it brings further economic activity. So
no question.
This represents tremendous spending. There's no way around that. I would counter that the difference in a tariff is that you're going to feel that up front right away, right? So to tie back to my recycling industry experience, Nucor and some of the domestic steel manufacturing companies were very excited by the tariffs because it gives them an unfair advantage and actually makes the consumer pay quite a bit more on their steel. Now, it was about a 25% tariff on the retaliatory trade war that went back and forth between the U.S. and China. The issue is that China is able to often bring in steel well below that. So it doesn't stop Chinese steel from coming in. It just makes the U.S. companies that are still buying it pay more, and then they're certainly going to pay advance those costs onto the consumer who's going to pay it. So your car, or your that's made out of steel, aluminum, or your food products like the many pork products that are in the canned goods and things that are on our shelves, those are all affected by this 25% tariff that they'll pass on to you.
Yeah. So you were importing pork? Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah. So actually, part of the retaliatory trade war is right. We were sending a lot of soybeans to China, and pork was coming here. And it's not necessarily that soy is always a food product. Sometimes it's a livestock feed, right? So it was tremendously, important to their industries. And I guess it kind of ties into what the point of these subsidies are, right? So to give you perspective, China is spending every single year the equivalent of the CHIPS Act, which is about like $50-60 billion in investment in research and development technology, right? So like building the schools to educate the people on this brand new emerging technology. We have one of the most important semiconductor manufacturers in the world. They're called the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. They took the strategic position to decide, let's not be the designer of chips, let's be the premier manufacturer, because they saw that the real bottleneck ahead is going to be the ability to make these chips. It's not the ability to design ever smaller ones. It's to actually materialize these fantasy chips and make them. So
yeah, I was going to ask, in your exploration of Taiwan Manufacturing Company, did you get into any research on ASML, the company? In fact, they're right in my backyard here in Wilton, Connecticut. They're only about a 10-minute drive from me. So ASML is Advanced Semiconductor Microlithology, and they actually build the billion-dollar machines that are the size of a semi-truck that get shipped to Taiwan, that build these wafers, and they're the ones that are able to provide them the technology to then actually do the manufacturing. So it is a really close partnership. I'm sure they're paying some sort of tariff on that huge machine to ship over there.
Absolutely.
So it really is closely meshed, and there's no question. We felt it with buying cars, and used car market went super high and hot because of it. One thing I saw this week that came to mind as you were talking about China and their investment, it was a statistic, and I'm going to botch the numbers, so I'm going to put it right on the screen when this is posted. But it was something like over 2 million chargers, and here's the number, right, in electric vehicle chargers installed in China right now, and it's exponentially higher than what we have. We have not even 1 million. We're like in the 200,000 or 300,000 range.
Right.
So
right.
Giving an electric vehicle subsidy so people are encouraged to buy more, that's great. I think it's a cost on the government. I'm now paying for everybody else's electric vehicle. But okay, common good. Listen, I'm a conservative. I love the environment. I'm an Eagle Scout. I want to protect our natural resources and all of our geology here. Really, I do. But I also think that we can advance towards a technological society in the right way, as China's done, but we don't need to become, and I'm going to say it, we don't need to become a communist socialist government to encourage this, right? Why can't we have capitalism encourage our friend, we have a friend who's
This
a
this
licensed electrician. Why
this
can't
is
he
this
go
is
to gas stations
capitalism.
and sell these Tesla chargers and go install them? Why do we need a government subsidy? Let's
So
get the little
absolutely,
man involved.
so absolutely, there's a lot of obstacles for smaller companies to get in, and I think a lot of it has to do with simply the cost of this technology, right? When there is no domestic competition to produce these things, because perfect case in point, ASML sends equipment overseas. The technological manufacturing like capacity exists only in Taiwan. The skilled laborers who can make these things under the facilities that are lack any UV lighting because it manipulates the lithography too much and stuff like that, that only exists there. So you're seeing companies like TSMC, who is now building plants in the United States, they're sending thousands of workers over to Taiwan for 12 to 18 months at a time to get up to speed and be educated to perform their roles here. So yeah, it's absolutely intertwined. There's certain complexities that prevent little guys from getting into the utility game or energy for sure. You're not going to find like a private contractor probably installing chargers at your local gas station and stuff like that. But like I said, I think this represents a critical change because it says that we're willing at any length to protect and actually nourish these industries in the United States. So, as I write about in my article, the world was not very happy with the IRA and the Chips and Science Act. In fact, the European Union is kind of creating their own Chips and Science Act because we're poaching talent from wherever, be it China or the EU and other key trade partners that we've regarded as allies for a long time. But every year inaction, I believe, costs us more, right? So we look year after year now that Taiwan has now become essentially the only place in the world for about 63% of the most important types of semiconductors in the world, right? The other one is Korea. They're the other remaining 30 something percent. Both these areas are in, highly contentious geopolitical, contexts, right? So
Absolutely.
we stand to the risk losing critical supply chains. So I guess that's where I'd argue that yes, it's subsidization. Yes, it's very expensive spending, but I think it's part of a key value that we should hold dear. And I think to demonstrate that about 80% of these funding projects have gone to red districts is that it is truly bipartisan and people are really, hoping that this does pay off in the future. It's a risk though, however.
Yeah, hey, listen, at least you admit it. And I didn't know that most of the money went to the red districts. And when you said that, what popped in my head was, well, hey, when Trump brought auto manufacturing back to Detroit, that's certainly a blue district. It's kind of funny how that
it's
works out.
It's unfortunately not there anymore. So this is the issue with tariffs. It doesn't create certainty. So I hope with the IRA, it does create either like a 10-year landmark in the federal code, and hopefully doesn't get undone. But it's kind of like 50 years of trajectory that we're kind of planning.
Yeah, well, hey, this is your opportunity to pounce on me. So they brought it out of Detroit? What are you telling me?
Yeah, so most of the manufacturing that was touted to come, they scaled back those jobs, the job counts significantly, and some of the projects altogether didn't, come to fruition. Again, so we run the risk of that too. So I'm definitely probably going to get flack for every single failed project that doesn't happen in the next 5 to 10 years as all these projects begin to ramp up and materialize. But so I said hopefully overall we're much more cognizant of the fact, and I like that it was kind of technology neutral. So it's really like any technology that you can prove that reduces a carbon footprint compared to like the existing non-renewable technologies. Go ahead. So that promotes hydrogen and nuclear power, which hydrogen could be kind of adjacent from the petrochemical industry. Again, if they have a part to play, I like involving the stakeholders in the process. It's fighting climate change, I would argue. You're fighting lobbyists from the petrochemical industries for this whole time. It's better to form a partnership rather than be so adversarial. So, like I said, I think it's exciting in those promises.
Yeah, honestly, actually, and I'm going to just say it, I'll piss a lot of my followers off here that are heavy conservative and want to just toe the party line. Truth is, I really dislike it when people go, I hate electric vehicles because I love internal combustion engines. Like, okay, listen, if you're an auto mechanic and you've been in a garage your whole life that you can't even clean under your nails because of all the grit, like, I get it. Maybe you really love engines and the way they work. But to say that we need oil, hey, okay, we do need oil. We can't run our entire grid off of just electric or renewables right now. So we definitely need petroleum products. But it is very short-sighted and strange to me that there is such a fervor to say, we need to retain gasoline, we need to retain internal combustion engines. It's certainly a shock to make the change, but it's a worthy shock. I think that our national animal is the bald eagle, and where do you think of? You think of the beautiful mountains of Montana and Utah flying over all that stuff. And hey, if we don't protect our environment, that's pretty silly, I would say. So I'm not one of those climate deniers. We definitely have a climate out there. Whether or not it's changing, I think, is part of the discussion. But no,
I'm a Teddy Roosevelt conservative myself. You know, as I travel the world, and I love going to places like many places in Europe, and they don't understand how large America is. They don't understand our population or truly how much land there is. You know, I don't think people can conceptualize how much beautiful nature that we have. And we need to think about certainly developing, building out, increasing inventories of homes so people have places to live. But protecting that natural beauty is so important, because once it's gone, it never comes back. And it really does make America so beautiful. I travel the rest of the world, so when I'm old and I can't move as much, I can come back to America, where we have the wonderful Americans with Disabilities Act, and I can go see all these wonderful places and natural parks, you know?
That's right. They have nice ramps to all of the sightseeing spots, which is great, actually. I just installed a sidewalk at one of the properties I manage to avoid the litigation there and help our patrons. But hey, so we definitely agree on that, and that's one of the things that I break away from. Renewables is important, and I've always been an advocate of, or at least of what I've heard, right, of nuclear. And what I've always been confused by is the pushback on that is to say that, oh, well, it would take 10 years to establish. Well, hopefully this officially will be our foot in the door. And when I hear someone in government saying, it doesn't make sense, it'd take too long to set up, like, hold on a minute. The Chinese freaking dynasty's been in power for 7 generations. We can't figure out 10 years in advance here. Like, what's going on? You know, this is why they're figuring it out and we're not. This whole continuity of government doesn't exist in our system. We have no strategic planning. One government makes an executive action and the next administration overturns it. So it's very uncomprehensive.
To both Biden's credit and detriment, much of his accomplishments in his first 100 days of presidency, which is marked as, since FDR, how are they doing on the job so far? Much of it is just rolling back, Trump administration things, right? So it's like, are you really doing anything, or just signing like executive orders? It's not massive accomplishments per se.
Yeah, exactly. And then one thing he didn't overturn was the conversion of NAFTA into the DMCA. Am I messing that up?
I am not familiar with the name, so I don't want to say it either. I was hoping you would remember the acronym, because I don't.
I have it over here.
It's certainly the Canada, Mexico, America agreement, something along those lines.
Right. So what it did, though, was it put larger tariffs on imports out of those nations, right? So that was when Trump said Mexico is going to pay for the wall that we're building. He was referring to this deal that he set up, because all of a sudden we were collecting more tariffs from him. And I've seen it. I've seen some economists say that during his presidency, throughout that period where that deal was negotiated, we actually did. We collected over, I think it was $5 billion or something through that. And that's exactly what was slated to build that wall.
Tariffs are not paid by the exporter, right? So not Mexico. They're collected on the importing country. So it's the or party. So the importing company or person is who's paying those $5 billion in tariffs.
Okay, so maybe I'm misinterpreting it then, that Mexico is paying us to import our goods, right?
Essentially, yeah. I mean, you could look at it that way, right? So the U.S. is willing to pay
that it was Mexico's money.
Is willing to pay extra to Mexico to build the wall,
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I misspoke originally. I'm saying that our exports that go to Mexico, they're forced now to pay a tariff to us, whereas before they were paying next to no tariff.
In that regard, yes, for sure. So so any exported products, because there was retaliation on it, and that's why we tried to hash out this agreement. But I will push back, because this is why I hope, whether Trump or Biden wins, we kind of stick to this industrial policy, because it's only fair to kind of give it a shake and hope that it works out. And we can't say whether it worked or not by dismantling all the really important, underpinnings of it. So and I agreed that we needed to renegotiate NAFTA. It was a 20-something plus year old agreement, and it was certainly, designed at a time when they were trying to pragmatically thread a needle, and not every issue was addressed properly. But to say could get some, incremental work done, they got that bill passed. It was needed to be overdone. So I find it ironic, though, that the Trump administration would platform on, not joining the TPP, but 95% of the language between this Canada, America, Mexico agreement was the same exact language from the TPP. And the TPP is ultimately designed to combat China's hegemony, trade hegemony in the region, right? So if we're really being harsh on China, it's joining things like the TPP, or even harshly negotiated, if that's what you need to feel that you need to do, to get leverage on China, right? Because it was with key trade partners in the region except China. So again, this is why I always think it's important to try to come together, especially on important things like industrial policy that takes decades to really materialize.
Yeah, well, listen, we're flexing our memory muscles, no question about that, because they're going all the way back to the TPP. I think that was one of his campaign promises. Trump said he was going to pull out. What I recall is that I was going to say it wasn't as strict for the European nations as it was for us, but I think I'm thinking of the climate accords for Paris, which was slightly different.
The Paris Agreement.
But here's what I would say then. I think that one of the issues that we have systemically here domestically is not only that whole clickbait title thing where we're kind of being told that these bills are helping one prevalent pop culture issue, and really they're kind of accomplishing other goals that may or may not be good. But that's the problem, is that we are pushing through, or we're being convinced to push through, this legislation that maybe is 80% effective or 90% effective, but we don't really take the time or have the earnest or honest discussions to say, hey, let's iron out those fine-tuned details so we don't have to revisit this in the future. And that's the disenchanting feeling I get from this border bill, or a lot of the money that we're sending to Ukraine and Israel. It's just not allocated or earmarked properly. It's a big mess.
I went to be a good student about this topic this week, and I'm like, let me just go glance at the Inflation Reduction Act, and oh my God, it's 1,300 pages, and it's like a lot of legal jargon. And after I got through the first 30 pages, and it's like I actually haven't gotten into any content whatsoever yet. There's just so little that's prescribed. I'm like, this is why you need two things, right? You need very sophisticated individuals in Washington, and we also need single issue legislation that just more narrowly, even in language alone, also addresses issues. Because if anyone's going to be an informed voter, you have to have at least, not necessarily laymen, but just somewhat ambitious individuals who might want to go out and read this legislation, be able to do so. We rely on so many intermediaries to be able to describe what the Inflation Reduction Act actually is. And as I'm doing my research, right, you're just following source that actually just cites another secondary source, rather than an economist who says, yeah, I've been doing this for 50 years. It's just like, oh, my news article is cited on this other news article saying that it's going to do this. So it's it's very difficult to tease out what are the laws.
I hate that. And then they always tell you it was debunked. Here's your PolitiFact, and PolitiFact links back to the Washington Post, which is just disgusting.
Newsweek.com, and it's like, okay, I wouldn't really regard that as right.
Well, Mike, listen, I'm grateful that you acknowledge that the Congressional Budget Office thinks that the Inflation Reduction Act, or at least they admit it, doesn't reduce inflation. I believe it will encourage it. You even hinted they might be printing money based off of it. But listen, that same organization that issued that statement, they have also in the past, right, and surrounding this Solyndra failure, they've said that there's more so than just that failure. There's questions surrounding the way that the DOE tracks their loans and their spending. That's Department of Energy, not Education. And it could be really brought into question. Now, after a decade of failures, we're going to write them the largest check they've ever seen, and, go for it. I don't think I could name the Department of Energy secretary right now, so I don't know if I have that confidence in our system the way it is now. What gives you the confidence that this is going to happen? I mean, is it the length and the breadth of the bill, or is it the administration that's controlling it? Is it the agencies that are getting it?
So my confidence in that is it is very capitalist, and I think that's where it's going to succeed on those merits. So again, subsidies create profitability that's not there, but the idea is that companies know that these subsidies exist only for 10 years. You're not going to build a many billions of dollar plant if you intend to somehow leave and take it elsewhere at the end of the 10 years. It's just very financially not feasible to do. So I think that a lot of these companies are laying down roots here. Again, it is very adversarial because you get like a company like Freyr Battery, who's recently invested in Georgia something to the tune of like $2 billion to create a battery plant there. It's on like an emerging lithium ion technology. It's upsetting countries like Norway because there was a project there that's slated by Freyr Battery as well that's kind of been stagnating and mothballed for a short while they're probably putting their focuses in on this. So I think that when you see the EU and you see China adamantly against this kind of legislation, it's a good thing when you're upsetting those kinds of partners, because I would argue that the US has been exporting this technology and expertise for too long. And I like to see that they feel upset that we're poaching innovative minds. That's what makes the U.S. so great, is throughout the years we've been that melting pot and or opportunity for any ambitious individual who wants to make a business. So I think this is a promotionary policy of that.
Yeah, well, hey, if Norway has great subsidy programs, which we know they do, but the downfall of the Scandinavian nations is they experience a 70% plus tax rate. And, United States citizens would absolutely freak out if that was announced, right? I'm even pushing back at a 15% tax rate.
Yeah, exactly.
So, no, I think that there's drawbacks and benefits. And actually what makes me more concerned to think about this is, okay, what's the longevity of investing domestically here in the United States? Well, in this very same bill that we're discussing, it talks about increasing the minimum wage. And hey, I am all for living wages, and I want our people in our country to prosper and have jobs and have living wages at well above $15 an hour. With that said, I think that it needs to be skilled work, and it needs to be warranted. You can't be a meth head out of the trailer park and expect to go start building semiconductors. So you have to go through the processes here. But also, right, doesn't that create this environment where costs are increasing because our people and our inflationary spiral is happening and money is more expensive? You can't just go to the Fed and borrow it anymore. It's twice as expensive as it was just 3 years ago, or throughout the entire Obama administration, right? 8 years of a flat interest rate from the Fed. Now you've got, I think it's like 8% or something like that to try to quell the inflation, and it's just not working. It keeps increasing. So, right, we've got actually terrible conditions to start a business right now, where if I were to become in the manufacturing world, I mean, there's no question. I would go to India. I would go to Bangladesh. I would go to Vietnam. I would go to the Philippines. Heck, I might even go to Korea if there weren't as much conflict there.
So you're touching on key reasons why you would go there, right? Is because, and people think that it's like, we need to be tough on China, but it's hard to be tough on China when, and it's not just to pin the blame squarely on Nixon because everybody was very excited about it, but during the Nixon era is when manufacturing really started to be outsourced there, because it was so much cheaper and more profitable for an American company to outsource the manufacturing there. I could say, well, I could hire, key administrators that are paid better. I could hire more salespeople to go sell my, more products. I don't have to focus on that manufacturing. And then the IRA and the CHIPS Act, they're certainly picking winners, right? It's the federal government deciding that no matter what, we're going to spend a lot of money to make sure that these industries are profitable and have a chance to flourish here. And that does come with tremendous risk, So hopefully this legislation is creating opportunities and situations where foreign companies or even domestic and keenly domestic companies are thinking like, oh, well, I got to go to America because, the preferential tax rate. And then, there's now an emerging base of new, like high trained employees that I can pull from these universities and stuff like that. So that's the thing. And many are deciding that the higher cost of living and wages for their U.S. employees are hopefully going to pay off with the tax benefits over time.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think making sure you're investing our taxpayer money into a proven business model and to, a business that's been around for a while with a track record, I get that. It's definitely the only option there. But while it creates barriers to entry for small business, that's without question a bigger risk. But
we certainly have to be concerned about inflation, though, for sure. Because, as I said before, if this very high-paying company moves to this area, which has a traditionally very low cost of living, right, that high-paying person now might be willing to pay twice as much for their cup of coffee. So that's where you might see a situation in a red state or something like that, where you all of a sudden these fancy coffee shops come up. Now my cup of Joe at 7-Eleven has gone up by a whole $1, right, because that's the market rate for it. So there's certainly concerns to be addressed as this develops over time.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking of like during these the last subsidies programs, which was like under Trump during the COVID era, where the Paycheck Protection Program,
Right.
or these are what really started us in this bad direction. And I think he wrote something like 6 or 7 trillion. I might be overstating that, but right, it's just a kind of foreshadowing almost of when we involve our monetary supply and we spread it too thin and we kind of distribute it all over. Yeah, the writing's on the wall that inflation is going to happen. That's just the result of it. So I think that one of the things we should talk about, and we're touching on it now, is the Federal Reserve and
Right.
how they impact kind of our monetary supply, the cost of money, literally, and how much it costs to borrow money. We talked in earlier this week with John, our commercial real estate broker there, how it's just not affordable anymore. People can't afford homes. People can't afford the mortgage payments on their incomes. Offices
Right.
aren't being leased, so prices are tanking in that respect. So what is your opinion on the Fed from when they were conceived, right, after or during World War One, to kind of balance this inflation that was happening, now to go to modern day, where it seems like they've been given this almost pop culture role, where
Right.
guys like those that might be on Reddit, Wall Street Bets, right, and following
Yeah.
Roaring Kitty, they're now logging in to C-SPAN to see what the Federal Reserve has to say month over
Right.
month, which is like
Yeah.
kind of wild. No one was interested in that a couple of years ago. So
Sure.
it is interesting to see that they've taken on this really figurehead pop culture role in how does our money work, and how is our economy going to respond. So do you think that they've got too much power in terms of pushing the print button, make the printer go brrr?
So there's no doubt that the Federal Reserve has a tremendous amount of power and an increasingly larger role as time has gone on. But I guess we gotta have to explain what inflation is so people could better understand what overall what we're talking about. It's an extremely complex topic, of which I am certainly gonna butcher some key terms or things like that. But I believe I'll get the general premise to the audience in a way that's at least understandable without having an economics degree. For background, I have a psychology degree with a focus on neuroscience, so I am not an economist by training, but I have spent quite a bit of time just trying to understand the basic tenets of it. So I'm not going to drown you with like an equationary model, but the idea is that inflation is simply too much money chasing not enough goods. And that equation can occur for many, many different reasons, right? So we could just talk about the situation of opening up a nice manufacturing plant with a high-tech, industry and high-skilled jobs. Now they're paying salaries that are twice or triple what they used to be, even the highest in the area, right? So somebody can now willingly pay a lot more for a cup of coffee and demand higher services, right? So it then sets a higher market price. If you're a business owner and there's more people in your marketplace with more money, you're not going to be a fool and undersell yourself, right? You're going to try to capitalize on the fair market rate of whatever this could be. It could be coffee, it could be energy, right? So that's where this kind of gets very complex. It could be food. So
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I mean, when I go to buy something, sometimes I'm fortunate, right, to not have to worry too much about what the price of a sandwich is. But there's sometimes I'll go and I'll say, hey, could you put guacamole on my Chipotle bowl? And they kind of look at me, oh, sir, that's $2. I go, yeah, it's $2. Give me my guacamole. It's not a big deal to pay it, but I can understand that for some people in those certain areas, that is a big deal, and you have to be cost conscious about that, especially when you're fighting for your living wage. So it does make sense. So that oligarchy, I'll call them, of the haves, or that bourgeoisie, they can decide where their money goes, and that dictates the market fluctuations. So it makes a lot of sense. And what's problematic, though, potentially, is that the people in our bureaucracy and our Federal Reserve have the means, so they're not the ones that are on the ground necessarily experiencing these big these hardships, right, that many American citizens are feeling.
So I have to. I follow a subreddit about Austrian economics, and it's not a school that I personally ascribe to. It's where Millet from
a little bit niche.
Yeah, no, exactly. There's three competing schools of thought, and in the U.S. we kind of follow like Keynesian economics, if that
Okay.
term sounds familiar. And then there's the Austrian School of Economics, which is a little bit more opposed. And one of the chief criticisms is that one of the powers that the Federal Reserve has is it has the ability to regulate loan rates, and they're the ones responsible for issuing loans to these other reserve banks, right? So your state level reserves, not your Federal Reserve, but your New York Reserve or the Reserve of California, right? So it gives an unfair advantage, technically in the idea of the Austrian economics, because these banks get preferential rates, and then they make their markup on those loans they do to the community, right? So whatever inflationary pressures happen, they don't have to worry about it because they get their money first and then loan it out to the community, right? So they've insulated themselves via latency of the effects of inflationary pressures. I would say this is how banks make money. They have to have this margin difference, and then they have to pay to secure your money, but that is a much more complex discussion to have.
I mean, right, let's simplify it. You probably get the emails like, hey, guess what? If you put money into our app at Robinhood or Coinbase, you get 5% annualized returns, or you get that from Goldman Sachs Marcus or all of these different high yield savings account right, which is a great idea. You got to have a savings account in this day and age, and you want to get high yield, but it just proves that the bank is going to pay me 5% just to hold my money for me,
because they
are guaranteed at 10%, 14%, right? So that's the game.
It's a big Ponzi scheme, right? Because the banks are taking your money and they're loaning it out and to businesses or other people, mortgages, things of that nature, right? So they're trying to make their margins on that. So it creates this situation then of much, much higher risk, though. So you always have to be careful about that, right? That's why we saw the 2007, 2008, crisis. But a lot of these, you want to open up a new account with us, you get $50 for your checking, or like you said, an annualized guaranteed rate of return, is because the Federal Reserve also has another power. The Central Reserve has the ability to set minimum liquidity requirements, right? So they say to this bank that you have to have 50% of your holdings, guaranteed, right, in liquidity. So the Federal Reserve can manipulate that, either increase liquidity requirements when there's higher risk, like after the 2007, 2008 crisis. And that's what many of the bigger banks complain about now, is all these liquidity requirements. And it's like, well, it's how we de-risk, the industry, is making sure that you have the money that people gave you.
Monopolies.
The people gave you money. You got to have the money in the bank, right? It's to prevent run-ons. But then they could also lower this liquidity amounts, right, to increase, spending and investments. So those are the levers that the Federal Reserve has. Another one that they have is through these meetings, right? So this is why they've become a pop culture item, right? Because the Federal Reserve, its purpose is by the federal government to decrease and manage unemployment. I shouldn't say just decrease, because it's manage unemployment. Full employment is actually very detrimental to an economy, because it means that there's not enough jobs out there, right? So part of the inflation that we're feeling is we've had such low unemployment for so long. So it gives workers the ability to negotiate higher wages, and that triggers through inflation through other means and things like that, right? But so the Federal Reserve has this ability to say, this is our plan. We want to communicate this policy over the next year. We plan to raise interest rates 3 to 4 times, but we're gonna, take that step by step. The whole point is they're walking on eggshells because they're trying to tell everybody what they plan to do without people wildly misinterpreting what they're gonna say and sending like emotional shockwaves throughout, the financial sectors.
Listen, I just got the news as we're on this call, and I'm going to bring it up here, even if it takes me a second. So this is the latest inflation update. It came out this morning. CPI, Consumer Price Index inflation, up 2 straight months, which is the first time this has happened since September 2023. So CPI, that includes food and energy, right? Mm-hmm. Now, annualized core CPI. So now we've removed food and energy. Highest since May 2023.
Right.
So we're going even farther back now into the pandemic era. You could say that we're still climbing higher than that. And then this doesn't have supercore, but PPI inflation nearly doubled year over year. Again, highest since October 2023. And annualized services CPI, highest since February 2023. And the Fed has been calling for a pivot, I think, in late March this entire time, but that was with the expectation that all of these numbers would go down. And these numbers are continuing to go up.
So actually, that does not bode well for lowering interest rates, right? So to tie back into that, one of the levers that the Federal Reserve has to try to bring some stability to the economy is to raise or lower these interest rates. And again, I'm gonna knock Trump a little bit. Is he'll complain about during the Obama administration them being so low, and then he'll complain to the Fed about them raising the rates during his administration. Is because it's all about trying to capitalize on the court of public opinion a little bit, but. Yeah. The issue is when we had such low interest rates, I would say that they were very effective at stimulating the economy during the Obama era, but that massively increases inflation, because you think about the spending. Our interest rates were like, I don't know if the Federal Reserve was sub 1%, but I think it was like very close to
0.25%.
Right, so it was even as low as 0.25%. When natural inflation is 2 to 3%, that literally means that the federal government is loaning money at a loss, 2.5% on those dollars, or 2.75% at sometimes the highest inflation of 3% with a 0.25% interest rate on those loans. Right? If you're a company, you'd be stupid not to borrow this money because it's free money, literally. You would just figure out reasons to spend it because it's going to be gone, hopefully, in the future, because free money can't last forever. We did that for, 10 or 12 years or something like that, a very low, inflationary rate, very low interest rates to try to combat, inactivity, but it certainly is going to promote inflation, and we're feeling that now, right? So there's these pressures that you were talking about. When we look at the consumer price index, then we have other measures like the core CPI, which is to try to remove the volatile energy and food costs, sectors that we see are probably associated with the Ukraine conflict. But even when you remove those, we're seeing it in the numbers, inflation is still very high, right? So it seems to be across the board in every category, and for every reason that drives inflation, it seems to be up.
Well, when we see, here's actually something I'd like to ask you about. I wonder if you're familiar with this. This is maybe a talking point as well from the right. I see that when we are sending money to Ukraine or we're signing these huge spending bills, of course, we are in a spending deficit and we're in debt. So presumably, if that was your own personal checkbook, you'd say, sorry, no more checks. I have no money. I couldn't do it. And the bank is not going to write you a loan either with a balance sheet like that. So what I've heard is that we're kind of tapping China for cash loans, and that they are the ones that are technically, we're going into debt to them. Is that something that you've ever heard, or that, makes any sense at all?
So I haven't heard that, but I'm going to try to understand like maybe the premise. I think what they're trying to get to, right? So when we no longer have a fiat currency and a fiat-based economy, right? So it's not based on, there's no gold-based economy. There's no physical standard to it. So I may be butchering that term actually a little bit. I think we are in a fiat economy, which is where we place our value based on our economic productivity, and that really does come from the Central Reserve saying like, based on our very thorough analysis, here's what the U.S. dollar is worth based on everything that we do and we buy and spend. If you're not bringing in enough revenue into the government via taxes or something like that, and we have spending bills that are in excess of that, and unfortunately for the last 2 decades, it's been about 125% spending of GDP. So we're running anywhere between a 20 to 25% deficit over 2 years. That money has to come
doesn't account for costs either.
Right. So that money has to come from somewhere. Where does it come from? You're printing it. But in order to preserve the value of printed money and not just say it's pieces of paper like Zimbabwe dollars that, just the zeros keep running on, you run out of room on the paper to fit that many zeros that you need.
For Venezuela too. It ends up in the gutter.
The idea is that you're selling this debt to other countries who are buying on this economic activity. And it's essentially just a very big bond. It's a security. It's a U.S. government bond, but on the international market. And we're going to borrow money, countries like China, but also many, many other countries throughout the rest of the world, and say, we're going to borrow economic capital from you, and we're going to pay you back plus, your VIG on top of it after a certain amount of time. So in theory, you could draw the connection that we are accruing more debt, which has to come from somewhere, which China is always continuing to buy American debt like many other countries. It's good money. They know it's a good rate of return, and they don't see an ending to this conflict. And I think China is actually really poised because China is benefiting greatly from the sanctions that have happened on Russia. Russia's ruble is worth nothing anymore, but they are a materials-rich nation. They have aluminum, steel, nickel, and tons of petroleum products that they can produce and energy itself. China says, well, your money's not worth anything, but I'd love to do credit trade, bartering based on the materials that you have.
Right.
So China all the while is happily buying American debt to fund this Ukraine war while propping up the Russian economy to their own benefit, for all this massive influx of materials that's going to stimulate their economy. So as the U.S., builds up this trade conflict with the IRA, CHIPS Act, etc., this is how China funds that, is through raw materials to their key trade partners.
Yeah, and then, well, it's interesting as you say that is it's kind of unpacking it, right? And then the United States is now sending that money to Ukraine, but all of a sudden Ukraine's buying all of our military equipment, so again, our GDP is increasing as well. So it's interesting. It's almost in a way a proxy war in this trade war continuation between China and the United States as the economic superpowers.
So in World War One, militarization changed greatly. No longer did you have wars that were profitable, and many people at the turn of the 1900s tried to have these arms agreements to slow it down because you used to be able to build a wooden ship that would last 100 years, and my God, that was an amazing investment, right? Now if you're not building a new ship every 4 to 8 years, you're woefully behind in technology. So how do you recover this cost, right? This is where the military industrial complex comes in. So whenever you see these big arms trade deals with these countries, it's because we're selling our old stock to finance new stock, right? That's what you do as a corporation. Well, I need to update all my computers, let me sell my old computers to finance the purchase of new ones. But it's weapons of mass destruction.
It's black triangles that are radar and stealth that fly 600 miles an hour. Yeah, you can't even see them. Hey man, listen, I think we touched on a lot of topics today. I know that we missed some of the stuff that we wanted to get to, but we went and covered a lot.
Sure.
So is there anything that you'd like to touch on as we wrap up here? Final closing thoughts?
Without creating another episode in and of itself, I think we covered a lot, but I also would like to point to follow our channels. We're improving our, diversity of channels and platforms that we're using, so check for us on Substack, check for us on all these other platforms because we're trying to be writing more. So if you want to learn more about this episode, stay tuned for the publications that are going to come from thereafter.
Yeah. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please, just know that if it's easier to watch on Spotify or on Twitter, you could do that as well, or vice versa. But what we do ask is please just throw us that subscribe because it's so important and it helps get a little bit more traction. So we're trying to keep it honest. We're trying to do the earnest thing here, have good faith discussions. I see actually, and I'm going to put them here on the screen when I edit this, but there's been so many comments recently that I've seen on X that there are nowhere to get both bipartisan opinions in the same spot. And we're filling that gap. So hopefully people are finding value in it. And I know I am. It's a good outlet, right? I don't have to burden my wife talking about economic policy or the history of the Cold War. So that's a good thing for my personal life. And hopefully people are gaining something from it. So Mike, thank you again. We're going to see you midweek with John again, because we're going to up our output here. And I couldn't be more grateful for you guys doing all this work with me and everyone who's listening. Thank you. Seriously, thank you.